Even as the numbers declined and the applause faded, she was never asked to return, not for an homage or a cameo. She was invisible one minute, and Carson's golden girl the next. Just a cruel, silent banishment with no reason. After this, she was never permitted to return to the Johnny Carson program, and she wasn't the only one. Additionally, a few celebrities found themselves on the receiving end of Johnny Carson's grin, and Hollywood turned its back on Johnny when he became aloof. What type of late-night ruler uses fear and charm to create an empire? We will soon find out. Hollywood used to be a place where one program had all the answers. This was the location if you wanted to be noticed. You wanted to be considered important. All you needed was that 5-minute time slot. And life would alter in an instant, if you smashed it. There was a catch, though. Everyone understood the restrictions that came with that spotlight, but no one dared to say them out. Worst of all, you were never in trouble with the powerful people in Hollywood, because you were immediately removed. Suddenly, some of the greatest names in the industry were shut out. Johnny Carson determined they no longer belonged, not because they were untalented or unloved by the public, and the rest of the industry abandoned you, after Johnny did. The problem is that the majority of viewers at home never noticed any of this. For a laugh, they simply tuned in, but there was a subdued tension beneath the laughter and clapping. It was over after one misstep and one misinterpretation. Sometimes it was something easy. It had become an issue if a guest made a joke that was too offensive or didn't give Johnny the final say. At other times it was more profound, and resulted from business choices that seemed betraying and loyalty problems. Then there were the private conflicts that began off-camera, and concluded in complete quiet. The subtlety of it all added to the intensity. No one was publicly criticized. There were no ugly headlines or large dramatic battles. People simply stopped coming. And if you asked around, you would probably get a quiet response or a shrug. However, it was terrible for people who were on the other side of that stillness. One missed invitation might ruin years of effort. Being kicked out of Carson was more than just a blow to your pride. You might lose your job as a result. Most people never hear that aspect of the story. Behind the scenes was the real story, in the guest chairs that remained empty, and the names that were never spoken again. What then was so potent about The Tonight Show? Why did it have such power over people's lives, reputations and futures? We must examine the show more closely in order to respond to that. The Tonight Show era, without having lived through it, it's difficult to describe the sheer magnitude of The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. There was more to this late-night conversation program than that. It was the place to be, particularly if you were a Hollywood heavyweight with a new movie to promote, a rising star or a frightened stand-up comedian. It really was that simple. If you got a spot on The Tonight Show, you were made. Johnny had a knack of making everything seem so easy. His cunning smile and the way he held a punchline for a fraction of a second longer than you anticipated. It was impossible to teach him timing. Not to mention Karnak the Magnificent, who was dressed like a fortune teller from a dollar shop, held sealed envelopes to his head, and spoke jokes that somehow became funnier due to their absurdity. It was iconic, but it was also silly and strange. His ability to start a career with just a nod, a laugh, and a simple wave to welcome a guest to the interview chair after their show, however, was where his true power lay. The holy grail was that Carson wave. Men like Jerry Seinfeld and David Letterman could attest to the significance of that event, and they'll tell you it changed everything if you ask them. And every night millions of people watched. This was prior to streaming and the ability to view videos on your phone while partially listening to a podcast. You either missed it or watched Johnny while he was on, and nobody, I assure you, wished to miss it. His monologues, skits, guests and musical act, which has since been imitated, were what made it memorable for everyone. It was used by talk show hosts Jimmy Fallon and Jimmy Kimmel. Additionally, it is currently being used by Stephen Colbert, host of The Late Night Show with Stephen Colbert. Host of The Late Night Show with Stephen Colbert. Carson was more than just a program host. He created the model for modern late-night television. For 3 decades, he managed his empire with ease, and was untouchable for the most part. However, a new side of Johnny emerged once the cameras ceased to roll, and the cheers subsided. Things weren't quite as easy underneath the humor and charm. In fact, they occasionally became blatantly hideous. You see, Carson's influence did have certain drawbacks, and there would be consequences if you irritated him. You wouldn't simply be removed from the program. The entire discourse was cut off from you. Losing Johnny's approval may completely destroy you, even as it could make you a star. There was more to this than sour feelings, or losing out on a single TV appearance. Back then, being banned from The Tonight Show was akin to being forgotten in the industry. Other shows would stay away, studio bosses would change their minds, and bookers would stop calling. Not wanting to step on Johnny's toes, he didn't need to speak in public. His quiet was enough to be heard. Everyone simply understood that you were done if Carson was done with you. The fact that he didn't have to make the announcement in public made it much more vicious. The guy on the other end of his microphone would no longer be scheduled if he simply talked about his day, and everyone in the industry is always aware of it. A few comedians attempted to dismiss it. Rich Little was among many who had to learn the hard way. Legendary impressionist Rich Little was fired for ridiculing Johnny too much, despite the official explanation that his work had simply become old. Dana Carvey was another comic who promoted Wayne's World by giving a perfect impression of Carson. Carson banned Carvey even if he didn't think it was humorous and remained silent about it. Like that. The frightening aspect was that until you fell off it, there was never a clear line or set of rules to determine the edge. So who risked losing because they dared to oppose Johnny? The aftermath of Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers was one of the people Johnny Carson mentored the most. She was a young, straightforward comic in the 1960s who attracted Johnny with her piercing wit and fiery passion. He made her a regular on The Tonight Show when female comedians weren't exactly common. Furthermore, he provided her a chance to become a national celebrity, particularly after she was rejected harshly for being washed up at the age of just 31. When Carson invited Joan to appear on The Tonight Show, she had been working hard in the clubs, chasing sets, and barely making ends meet. He turned to the camera, smiled and said, "America, you're going to hear a lot about this girl." After she killed that first set, everything changed with that one line. With Carson's help, Rivers went from nothing to getting hired as a writer for Tonight Show. In addition to allowing her to flourish, he supported, encouraged, and even invited her to become his regular guest host on the nights he was off. The king of late night and his dependable queen-in-waiting appeared to be a perfect pair to the outer world. But a storm was building behind all the cheers and laughter. Fox made Joan an offer to start her own late-night program in 1986. Given that Fox was a relatively new network and she had the opportunity to headline a major late-night talk show, it was revolutionary news. The choice was not one she made lightly. Interviews revealed that Joan was afraid. When Carson finally resigned, she realized that NBC had no intention of giving her The Tonight Show, even though she didn't want to Johnny. Worst of all, she accepted the Fox deal after learning from NBC management that she wasn't even being considered. However, the fact that she didn't tell Johnny first was the thing that made all the difference. It wasn't Joan who told Carson, but the rumors. He was enraged. Furthermore, it wasn't the sort of anger you shout about and then move on from. Carson was quiet, icy and brimming with resolute anger. When she called, he hung up and said he would never talk to her again. For years he ignored her attempts to get in touch and never returned her letters. She was gone from that point on. She wasn't just kicked off The Tonight Show, she was also blacklisted and forbidden. Even worse, Johnny's couch was off limits to anyone who dared to appear on her Fox show. According to insiders who worked on the show, Carson was taken by surprise. The fact that she went for a new show alone didn't matter to him. His focus was mainly on loyalty. She had gone behind his back, he believed, and such betrayal was not acceptable in Carson's universe. To him, she was like a daughter. But once you broke that trust with Johnny, you were done, recalled a former employee. Joan was devastated on her end. When she spoke about Johnny in interviews years later, her voice continued to crack. He was the most significant person in her career, she said. She claimed that despite her best efforts to write him a letter each year, she never received a response. Not a single word. And quiet wasn't the end of it. Carson ensured that her name was removed from the history of The Tonight Show. Clips of her appearances were buried for decades. She became the show's unseen woman, as her name was never mentioned. She later said, "I think he really felt because I was a woman, that I just was his, that I wouldn't leave him," explaining why she thought Carson was upset about her leaving. "I realize this seems incredibly twisted, but I can't figure out what else was happening." Joan acknowledged that she cried when Carson died in 2005. She lost her mentor, and the first guy to ever believe in her, not because the world had lost a significant character. The fact that he died before they could work out their disagreements just made her grief worse. During an interview, she once stated, "I would have done anything to make it right. He refused to even look at me when I tried to converse." And it wasn't just Joan. On air, some were subjected to Carson's fury. The Tonight Show did not ban everyone for being impolite or obnoxious. Some were simply unsure of when to stop. Some believed they could nudge the bear and go on. However, with Johnny Carson, even if you didn't mean to, you were done once you went too far. For instance, Bobcat Goldthwait. He was crazy, and had a boisterous, erratic spirit that might make you laugh or uneasy. He went too far one night. In fact, Bobcat purposefully set the chair on fire during a live television broadcast. He thought of that as a stunt. However, that was a poor joke that didn't sit well with everyone. Some believe Johnny Carson would not have been impressed, despite the fact that Jay Leno was the host at the time. In a fit of rage, the network barred Bobcat from the program. In addition, he was detained, found guilty of arson, and fined $2,700 in addition to the chair's approximate $700 purchase price. He was also given a sentence that included making fire safety PSAs. Never again did he set foot on the stage. His hopes of having a late night were permanently destroyed by that one instant. Kathy Griffin is the next one. Being audacious, outspoken, and unrepentant is the hallmark of Kathy's brand. She discusses topics that most people steer clear of, and she doesn't give a damn who is offended. Many late-night anchors, particularly Jay Leno, who followed Carson, didn't like such attitude. Not just once was Kathy's edgy humor deemed excessive. She eventually discovered that she was barred from several programs, including The Tonight Show. She might not have been explicitly forbidden by Carson, but she certainly matched his description of someone who wouldn't have passed his muster. The doors silently closed after one too many offensive jokes. Melanie Chartoff, on the other hand, didn't blow anything up. She didn't curse live or make fun of anyone in front of the camera. She just made jokes that weren't particularly noteworthy. She frequently made other crew members chuckle with her remarks, and the quips made Johnny chuckle too. She didn't have any problems with Carson, because she was one of the few people that got along with him. She even made an appearance as a guest on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, including a memorable 1982 episode with George Burns and Richard Dawson. That is Carson's problem. Sure, he might make or ruin a career, but he could also kill it if you weren't careful. If he took it the wrong way, you were out, even if you didn't mean to step on his toes and it was only a joke that was muttered behind the scenes. But not all Tonight Show bans were the result of disobedience or revolt. Some were simply miscommunications, sincere errors, misinterpreted jokes, or unapproved moves. And all of a sudden, you could lose Johnny's favor with only one move. The hard way was how Howie Mandel learned it. Early in his career, Johnny Carson was still learning the ropes and attempting to make an impression. He therefore took a huge plush tiger to the stage one evening, a prop not included in the plan and not approved by the makers. It was meant to be humorous, absurd, and merely meant to make people laugh. Surprises were something Johnny detested, especially when they disrupted the show's flow. Howie was never welcomed back after that night. No official prohibition, no irate letter, just quiet, silence, icy, cruel. Then there was the charismatic and gifted Lola Falana. Every time she entered a room, she illuminated the stage. She did, however, openly discuss racism in the profession during one occasion. She discussed her experiences as a black woman in the entertainment industry. She was brave and honest at a time when most people were too afraid to even mention such things. However, Johnny wasn't prepared for that type of late-night TV talk. Lola was gone in an instant. She was not invited again. In that context, America was still not prepared to hear the truth. Even though he was strong, Carson didn't want to upset anyone. Not even Artie Lang was excluded. His tail changes course. Carson didn't prohibit him for it. Years later, Conan O'Brien banned him. Artie was battling an addiction at the time. He was difficult to control and erratic. Conan's staff broke off relations. It was like a kick to the stomach at the time. However, in retrospect, Artie claims it saved his life. He had to hit pause in order to receive assistance. And he did thank Conan when he was sober at last. He said that his ban marked the start of his resurgence. A ban occasionally marked the end of your career. At other times it was simply the harshest wake-up call in the world. On one occasion Johnny Carson did say something, and this time it was loud, but otherwise he did his thing in silence. A feud in Hollywood. Wayne Newton and Johnny Carson had that old-fashioned show business friendship for a spell. In their own right, they were both celebrities. While Newton wowed Vegas audiences with his voice and his charisma, Carson dominated the late night from behind his desk in Burbank. It was all grins, giggles, and handshakes when Wayne appeared on The Tonight Show. However, friendships in Hollywood are subject to fine print, and egos aren't always compatible. When Newton boldly outbid Carson for a portion of the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas in the early 1980s, things took a different path. Newton saw it as merely business, thus it wasn't personal, at least not from his perspective. However, Carson saw it as a challenge, akin to a friend entering hostile territory. Backstage, Johnny didn't confront him. He converted it into stuff like he always did. Carson began inserting jabs into his monologues night after night, but they weren't the amusing ones. He questioned Newton's masculinity and made fun of his appearance, made fun of his way of living, and referred to him as a cruel person. These jokes seemed more like covert insults than late-night humor. Newton was not amused by the laughter from the audience. When Wayne finally had enough, he walked into NBC studios one day without any cameras or an entourage. He personally located Carson backstage and urged him to stop it right away. Depending on who is narrating the encounter, the specifics change. One thing, though, never changed. After Carson stopped making jokes about Newton, the mocking ceased. Their friendship also did. Wayne Newton never received another invitation to appear on The Tonight Show. Not as a visitor, not even for a passing visit. The hint had been picked up by Carson. However, the link ended as soon as the curtain came down, just like everything else in his world. Additionally, Carson's personal life began to fall apart as his power increased. Let's take a moment to comprehend the man behind the curtain before we get into that. Johnny Carson's ascent to stardom. Johnny Carson was a tiny kid from Nebraska with a deck of cards and a dream long before he became the king of late night. He began doing magic acts for his family at the age of 12, claiming to be the Great Carsoni. He could effortlessly hold anyone's attention without talking too much because of his stage presence. But for Johnny, magic was more than simply a pastime. He needed to make the most of himself. After serving in the Navy during World War II, he earned a degree in speech and radio from the University of Nebraska. From there he worked various jobs in radio and television to pay his bills, moving up the ladder one job at a time. People instantly realized something when he was asked to step in for Jack Benny, and that was his big break. Carson was effortless, in addition to being good. When he became the host of The Tonight Show in 1962, things really took off. Millions of people tuned in every night, not only to laugh, but also to feel as though they were spending time with a familiar person who had excellent timing and razor-sharp wit. Johnny never had to work hard to make you laugh. He had the unique ability to give the impression that he wasn't trying at all, and it was magical because of that. Offstage, however, was another kind of show. There was more to Johnny than what everyone saw around 11:30 p.m. Carson was extremely, sometimes agonizingly, private behind the scenes. His friends, colleagues, and even visitors who believed they would get along with him frequently discovered this the hard way, that Johnny kept people at a distance. He adored the camera, and he was charming. However, he restricted and protected what others could see. There was a place for everything and everyone, and it needed more than a handshake and a joke to enter his private world. He detested losing command. He handled his relationships, particularly with visitors, with the same drive to control his stage. You could sense the shift if someone spoke over him, outshone him, or took too long to get to the punchline. The temperature decreased, but the smile persisted. At times, Johnny appeared to be the most lonely person in the room, despite having the most watched late-night show in America. And he carried that tension into his marriages, his family, and his latter years after leaving the theater. Private life in chaos. Despite his skill on the sound stage, Johnny Carson's personal life was far from a flawless performance. Home was where chaos ensued, if the late-night desk was his throne. Each of his 4 marriages has a unique tale of love, misunderstandings, and silent breakdowns. Before he became famous, he married Jodie Wolcott for the first time. But the gap between them grew as Carson's star climbed. He then acknowledged the rumors of infidelity, and said that he wasn't very good at being faithful. Anything solid was eroded by the late nights, the attention, and the ego. On the surface, his second marriage to Joanne Copeland appeared to be dazzling. She was smart, gorgeous, and there for him when he needed her most. But that marriage was a battleground behind closed doors. Both parties were involved in infidelity, and they finally fell apart due to the tension. In one of his well-known on-air jokes about his divorces, Carson said that his ex-wives had taken everything but his cufflinks. However, the quips were only armor, and beneath the snark lurked sadness. The same pattern of highs and lows and a highly public breakdown characterized his third marriage to model Joanna Holland. However, things had altered by 1987, when he wed Alexis Moss. Perhaps it was time, he realized he was older. Perhaps he had finally had enough of the spotlight in his living room. His last marriage was more subdued and discreet. At least from the outside it appeared like he had at last achieved some tranquility. However, not everything was fixable. Among the most publicly tense aspects of Carson's life was his connection with Rick, one of his 3 sons from his first marriage. Rick battled substance misuse, legal issues, and the stress of being the son of the most popular TV presenter in America. Carson was distraught when Rick passed away in a terrible vehicle accident in 1991. The following time he was on TV, you could see it in his eyes. Suddenly, the guy who had made a whole country laugh was frail. Unlike many celebrities, Carson didn't stay around after retiring in 1992. He didn't seek attention or go right into another project. He simply vanished and relocated to Malibu. He declined nearly every interview and spent more time on his yacht. He was a recluse, but he wasn't resentful or anything. All he wanted was to get rid of television, and all that went along with it. Carson's legend endured, despite the world being kept out. The legacy of Johnny. With just one look, Johnny Carson had the ability to make everyone in the room laugh. Nevertheless, you may be with him for years and never truly get to know him. He lived a contradictory existence. He was the king of cool, captivating, and quick-witted on stage. He was quiet, secretive, and somewhat inaccessible off stage. And he carried that paradox with him to the very end. It was already too late when the world found out that Carson was gravely ill. The man who previously attracted millions of people gently disappeared into the background. Stress, the consequence of a lifetime of smoking, was what ultimately got to him. He died in 2005, and without any ceremony or lengthy farewell, the curtain went down permanently. But long exits were never Johnny's style. Nevertheless, Carson had already made television history long before his health deteriorated. A Peabody Award honoring 25 years of hosting The Tonight Show, a quarter-century of late-night enchantment, cultural commentary, and unadulterated television brilliance, was given to him in 1987. By the middle of the 1970s, he was not only a well-liked TV host, but also the highest-paid television personality, earning tens of millions of dollars annually. You can tell he was a top dog in the entertainment world at that level. Nevertheless, Carson began to retreat. Perhaps it was premonition, or perhaps it was burnout. He started reducing the number of times he appeared, allowing guest hosts to take over. Joan Rivers was one of the guest hosts. It was Carson's show, which is ironic given the conclusion of that story. And his presence was always felt, even when he wasn't there. He didn't retire with his influence. His fingerprints are still visible on late-night television today. Carson's DNA is in the blueprints for everything from Jimmy Kimmel's shrewd edge to Jimmy Fallon's youthful charm. The conversations with guests, the desk tidbits, and the monologues. Carson came up with the original recipe. Since then everyone has only added a little seasoning. Yes, Johnny was not flawless. Although he was a master of his trade, he occasionally exhibited coldness, dominance, and even cruelty. A force of culture, a man with room ownership skills. Even when the entire nation was in the room, he added a little humor, a little gossip, and a lot of elegance to the way America concludes the day. And that's Johnny Carson's peculiar charm. To feel that way, you didn't need to know the man. He didn't leave behind a memoir or candid interviews. The sound of laughing, which is still heard in late-night replays, served as a reminder that he used to be the night's dominant force. Have you attended any of Johnny Carson's performances before? And how did his influence affect people's lives, in your opinion? Tell us in the comments section. To ensure you don't miss any of our uploads, please hit the notification bell, like and subscribe to our channel. To view more videos like this one, click the next one that appears on your screen.